Hello, my name is Ben Columbi. I'm an associate professor at the University of Arizona, and my primary appointment is in the American Indian Studies program, and I also hold affiliated appointments in the School of Anthropology, School of Geography and Development, and the School of Natural Resources and Environment, and I'm also now serving as the faculty director of the graduate interdisciplinary programs. I was really grateful and honored to have received a CERCLL grant in the spring of 2016 to facilitate my recent fieldwork in Russia. I was able to travel to St. Petersburg, Russia in September of 2016 and meet a small team of linguists and, importantly, a small group of indigenous speakers who are Itelmen from the peninsula of Kamchatka in the Russian Far East. My earlier work leading up to September's fieldwork, which was supported under the CERCLL grant, is related to a Fulbright Scholar Award that I received in 2014 to travel to Kamchatka for the first time and work with two indigenous groups, one the Itelmen, who I just mentioned, and the other the Koryak peoples. And so I spent about 5 months in the fall of 2014 working with communities along the west coast of Kamchatka, and I can say a bit more about that in just a moment. By training, I hold degrees in anthropology, and increasingly I'm becoming more and more interdisciplinary. And what I mean by that is I'm most interested in environmental anthropology, and I'm most interested in indigenous areas of research. And I have worked very closely with indigenous peoples across a large portion of the North Pacific on issues related to salmon fisheries. So it's kind of ironic that I landed here in the American Southwest at the University of Arizona. I'm primarily known as an anthropologist who knows a bit about or a lot about salmon fisheries, but in general I work closely with indigenous communities, not only in the Pacific Northwest, where I did a lot of my dissertation work with tribes along the Columbia and Snake Rivers, namely the Nez Perce tribe of Idaho, but I'm also increasingly doing work here in the Southwest because of my appointment here at the University of Arizona. And then I've been, over the last 11 years or so since being faculty here, I've been building my work across the North Pacific. And so let me get to the point. The CERCLL grant was specific to funding my travel to Russia, to St. Petersburg, to work at two museums in St. Petersburg with, again, this small team of linguists and native elder speakers from Kamchatka. And we worked at the Kunstkamera, which is the Peter the Great Museum of Anthropology, which is the largest anthropology museum in Russia that houses most of the collections from all over the world, as a matter of fact, but the most primary collections of artifacts from Kamchatka are housed there. And then the other museum that we worked at is the Russian Museum of Ethnography. It's the National Museum of Ethnographic Research. It is more of sort of in some ways, the research arm of ethnography, but that's not to say the Kunstkamera doesn't. They also have Russian researchers that are working throughout Russia on ethnographic anthropological concerns. And so the idea of going to these two museums was to primarily view collections that were largely gathered during the Bering I and Bering II expeditions, which occurred starting in the 1820s through the 1830s. These were the first systematic sort of anthropological expeditions occurring in Kamchatka. And then we also were looking at collections that were gathered in the late 19th and very early 20th centuries during the Jessup North expeditions. So you have the Bering I and II expeditions, earlier part of the 19th century, and then you have the Jessup North expeditions happening in the late 19th, early 20th century under the guidance of Franz Boas, who is considered to be the father of modern-day anthropology. And he sent several anthropologists who were either German or Russian at that time to Kamchatka to work with indigenous communities, to record their languages, to collect artifacts of importance, to document and record traditional ways of life. These collections are incredibly valuable not only to anthropologists in general, but especially to linguists, right? So I know the CERCLL grant is obviously very specific to language and literacy and culture. And so the team of linguists that I'm working with are renowned, and they are linguists who are experts in the Itelmen language. And what makes the Itelmen language quite unique and of interest is it's highly endangered. There are 5 fluent speakers left in the world today. We had 4 of them with us in St. Petersburg. And so accompanying the CERCLL grant was not only funding for my travel to the museums and to spend several weeks at these museums, but I also got a grant from the National Science Foundation Arctic Social Sciences Program to fund the travel of the delegation of native speakers and to fund the travel of this small team of linguists to all meet or convene in St. Petersburg. And so we spent most of our time connecting with archivists who worked at the museum, and we had contacted them beforehand and explained to them that we were bringing this delegation. And the elders, out of the 4 that were with us, only 1 had been to St. Petersburg before. And so the elders were quite taken aback by, getting on a giant airplane, flying to St. Petersburg. They were a bit scared of the escalators that took them into the metro, which is the subway in St. Petersburg. And so it was fun for me as a researcher to have the elders there, to see how they were interacting, not only with the collections, but just being in a big cosmopolitan city like St. Petersburg, because Kamchatka is 9 time zones to the east of St. Petersburg, and it's kind of another almost different world from what is happening throughout much of Russia. The Russian Far East is where Kamchatka is situated. It's not really in Siberia, but it's connected to Siberia. And the Russian indigenous peoples there's 5 groups, and they have a lot of connections to other indigenous groups, historically, linguistically, and culturally, within the Russian Far East and also in northern Japan with the Ainu-speaking peoples of Hokkaido. And also, if you arc across North Pacific, there are a lot of connections with the indigenous peoples there to those in western Alaska, the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, and so on. What also makes the Itelmen very unique linguistically is not only is it extremely endangered, the language, but it's also a language isolate. So there's just no other family that they belong to. They are completely isolated from other families. And so the linguists are quite concerned about the fact that the language is not being spoken but by only a very small few, and the fact that there has been recordings of the language, there has been some earlier sort of writing down of the language by anthropologists and linguists, but nothing very systematic. And so this team of linguists that I'm working with, Jonathan Bovelik, who's at the University of Connecticut, is leading the study. David Kester at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, who's an anthropologist but wears many hats, he's also a linguist, are creating not only a more expansive and detailed dictionary of Itelmen, but also creating a digital dictionary of Itelmen. And so when we were viewing these collections with the elders, they were interacting with the collections. Archivists would lay them out on a table. These were collections that were largely not purview for the public. These were private collections housed in the archives of the museums. And so archivists would lay out collections for the elders. We would sit down at a table. The archivists were very, very accommodating, were collaborating with us. They were excited to have these elders here at their museum. And we would go through artifacts like baskets, like stone tools, like digging sticks, other kinds of technologies that people had used in the past in Kamchatka. I mean, a lot of these technologies are used to some degree today in Kamchatka, but to a large extent have been replaced by more modern day techniques. And so the elders would recall oftentimes having knowledge of these artifacts from when they were children, perhaps their grandparents and their extended relatives. They would interact with these artifacts because they remember that using these artifacts when they were children with their family, and then so they would start to get into a conversation with each other, which of course for the linguists was adding another layer of interest, because not only were these speakers speaking about the material remains themselves, but they were communicating with one another about them.
Ik man het chill, kazaj kitje kaman mas olank. Akhe ankan yei konk. Ankat yei pat noje chtrwast. Tanak tikos kitchen ti pak eipi. Unko. Tanak tikos kameta kos. Kameta sen chukstuju. Вот так вот. А каких ты ну? Айтолахшим.
Ма Эйтулах, да?
Да, ма Эйтулахшим. Танах
Чекакать алькасть.
Тыш. Хокчкын пину чекжужи. И тынхатыш. А потом шины хокманг пикижин тхин ану кладовка. Он тынхакжуш. И танах чилкжушки машкаланка. А сыны тханка. Ножен чхам чех ажуатышпина. Эй, патыш. Вот он кончил кукиче. Понял.
And so there was incredible knowledge gained about the cultural significance of these artifacts and how they are attached then to the vocabulary of the language, the descriptions that will appear into the dictionary and into the digital dictionary as well. So we shot video footage, audio footage, lots of still photography. We have thousands and thousands of photographs collected under this grant. Several hours of video footage that still needs to be edited. There's been one journal article so far published by Jonathan Bobolik, the linguist at the University of Connecticut. There are others coming out from this work. I just published an article in the journal Siberica with a couple of my colleagues, one a former student of mine, Tatiana Degai, who just got her PhD here at the University of Arizona in American Indian Studies with a minor concentration area in linguistics around language revitalization. She's from Kamchatka. So she came here, I recruited her here to the U of A. She just finished her PhD in spring of 2016. She was at the museum visits as well, along with her grandmother, Vika Petrosheva. And Vika Petrosheva, I want to say a few things about her because she's an interesting indigenous elder from Kamchatka who is active not only in the CERCLL Grant project in St. Petersburg, but other projects that I'm involved with, because she grew up in a very remote village in Kamchatka. She was born on a reindeer sled on the tundra. Yeah, she's 75 years old this year. And when she was a young girl, she was sent away to boarding school, as were many indigenous kids during the mid to late Soviet period. And the Soviet educators and planners noticed that she was a high performer in schools. And so she was encouraged to go on to university and then encouraged to go on to get her PhD. And so she received her PhD in ethnography, essentially anthropology, from Moscow State University in the late 1960s. She is a celebrated elder from Kamchatka, but she's also part of what they call the indigenous intelligentsia in Russia. And this is a whole generation of indigenous peoples that were educated in this boarding school system during the late Soviet period that then some went on to university to get advanced graduate degrees. That doesn't really exist anymore because the boarding school system isn't in place since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and oftentimes it's more often the case that the indigenous kids today aren't going off to university. It's a rare exception. Where in the past it was more encouraged and supported by government infrastructures. So I've worked closely with Victoria Petrosheva, Tatiana's grandmother, over the years. She and I traveled together for 5 months across the Kamchatka Peninsula during my Fulbright grant. I had a teaching and research grant that mainly funded me to travel the length of the peninsula with this elder, visiting different communities along the way. And not only was I recording different cultural activities like salmon fishing, which I'm very interested in, but also being exposed to interests around revitalizing the language, revitalizing cultural traditions, issues around securing greater rights to fishing and hunting resources. And what I found really interesting about Russia in general, especially the Far East indigenous peoples and foreign researchers, is that they're very open to collaborating with foreign researchers. I think the reason for this is, well, for one, there hasn't been a lot of research done in collaboration with indigenous peoples there. There's only been a handful of anthropologists who work in this part of Kamchatka. And two, they also see this as a way to bring about awareness of who they are to the rest of the world. So this grant is also supporting this sort of cultural awareness of who these people are, what are their histories, what are their cultural traditions, and what do their futures look like. And so by them working with foreign researchers, they're also able to not only collect more data about themselves so they can pass that knowledge on to future generations, but they also look at this as a way to strengthen their presence not only outside of Russia, but at some point in the future within Russia in terms of gaining greater sovereignty, again, over land resources, marine resources, hunting and gathering, fishing resources. So it's been a fascinating experience for me to take my work, which is grounded here in the United States with Native nations, indigenous peoples, and then to think about that context and the post-Soviet world in Russia. So there's a lot of connections there. In terms of the work beyond the ethnographic recordings that we did during the museum work and the linguistic recordings that we did and the adding that into the dictionary, we also, part of the CERCLL grant was to support the publication costs for this booklet. This booklet is, it's all in Russian with the exception of a dictionary that is in the middle part of the book that lays out a dialect of the Koryak language from the village of Lesnaya. So as part of my Fulbright grant, Vika, the grandmother of Tatiana, and I traveled to Lesnaya, which took us about 16 hours from one village. We had to ride a tank over 2 mountain ranges, across about 5 rivers. We sat on top of the tank. She actually sat with the driver in the enclosed cabin up front, and myself and other community members sat on top, and it was freezing snow and rain. It was at the end of October, early November, and this is how villagers get around. They can't really afford to fly helicopters or small aircraft, so they use these old Soviet tank-like machines that go over the tundra. So we got to this village and we worked with a few of the elders that are the last speakers of the Nimilan dialect of Koryak. Koryak are the group north of the Itelmen. These are largely reindeer herding peoples, but the Nimilan speakers live along the coast, so they're maritime Koryaks. And so they practice a mixed economy of reindeer herding and also salmon fishing and marine mammal hunting and so on. Fascinating stuff. And so we created a small list of vocabulary words in both English, Russian, and Nimilan words such as aunt, uncle, nephew, niece, grandma, grandfather, and so on. Phrases such as hello, how are you, bye, where do you live, and so on. And then also words such as earth, river, spring, lake, forest, volcanoes, dwarf pine, pine nuts, birch, seal, beluga, sea lion, whale, fish, all the species of Pacific salmon, and so forth. I mean, so you can kind of get an understanding of the connection that these people have, not only to the environment, but to the resources that sustain them in this incredible part of the world. And so would you like me to wrap things up? Am I running out of time? See, so the CERCLL grant published over 1,000 copies of this booklet. We're very grateful for that. We had a press in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, which is the capital city, publish the book. And then these booklets have been distributed to community members in Lesnaya and elsewhere in Kamchatka. It's of great value to community members to have this resource. And so the CERCLL grant was, again, linking up to previous grants and previous work, and was able to assist with a very important project that I mentioned to you that occurred in September in St. Petersburg. And so we're just moving forward with applying for more grants, to do more field work this summer and fall in Kamchatka, and to continue this work forward. Thanks.